Bill the Flavor Guy here. Today we're going to talk about flavor powders. What a flavor powder is, what makes it different from other types of flavors, and we'll talk about usages and things like that. I'll jump around a little bit. A flavor powder is simply what it says. It's a flavor that's in a powder form versus in a liquid form. The biggest difference, I should say, in a flavor powder is how it's used, because flavor powders don't really hold flavor very well, especially the old style flavor powders, which was called plating. For the most part, flavor powders are used in applications where you can't use a liquid. So you're making a powder mix, for instance, you want to make a homemade isotonic or sports drink or protein drink, or you just want something like, you know, when I was a kid it was Kool-Aid. You could make a homemade version of that, your own version of a powder drink. You can make it better because you can make it with natural color, natural flavors. You can add vitamin C in a powder form. You can add other kinds of vitamins if you want to. You can add potassium salt, so you can make it like an isotonic, like that stuff that you buy in the bottle that's artificially colored. But what you can't do with flavor powders is you can't really cook with them. The old style formulas used powdered flavors to cook with. When you use them, went to taste the finished product, like a cake recipe or something, if it was a strawberry, there wouldn't be any flavor left. It would be gone, because powder flavors don't do well in baking. They just don't like to be heated. If they have natural color added to them on top of that, the color fades, because natural colors don't like heat either. So when you bake with a flavor powder, your kitchen's gonna smell great. You're gonna love that. I always recommend when you're baking, if you can, use a liquid flavor. But if you're making an old-fashioned or an old-style baking recipe, and you're putting it in powder form to put in buckets to save for later, then you don't have a lot of choices, unless you add the flavor later when you bake. Powder flavors are traditionally made by plating the flavor onto a sugar base or a starch base. If you were to look at it under a microscope, an electron microscope would be great. You'd see these big crystals, they look like Mount Everest. They spray the flavor oil onto these crystals, and the oil kind of gets inside and kind of encapsulates the crystal. And the flavors, technically, it's on the outside of the crystal and it has a drying effect, but the flavor is still exposed to air, and that's why they don't bake well, because it flash off the crystal or off the plating medium. Even in storage over time, it oxidizes because it's constantly exposed to oxygen. Then there's the more newer style flavors where they're spray dried, and that's where the oil of the flavor and a gum like gum acacia or starches are shot in. Basically, it's an enclosed chamber. It's superheated at about 400 degrees. It's in a vortex. Everything's spinning around and they're superheated. The gum and the oils are sprayed right next to each other, and they're charged. One's negatively and one's positively charged, and they kind of wrap around, the gums or starches wrap around the flavor oils, instantly encapsulating it and drying and falling to the bottom, and to capture that powder. The bad part about that is that 40 to 50% of the flavor is actually lost. It never gets encapsulated, it just evaporates, and that makes that whole process very expensive, because the flavor oil, if it's pure, is the most expensive ingredient in the flavor. And if 50% of it's going up in the air, well, that could be in the tens of thousands of dollars per pound. That's how expensive these oils are. And there's another way, which is to freeze dry. And that's a more complicated process, also a little more pricier than the plated flavor, but by far the most sustainable and best method. And what that entails is you emulsify the flavor and then you freeze dry the flavor. In the case of citrus flavors, which are by far the worst flavors to try to make into a powder because they oxidize rapidly, well, that method gives you about a year to 2 years of shelf life. It's probably worth the cost because you're not going to throw away as much flavor. You're going to have a fresher flavor for a longer period of time. And so here at Nature's, we like those the best. The particle size, when you're making a powdered product of any type, you want all your particles to be about the same size. That's super important, because if you have big particles of crystallized citric acid or sugar, and really fine powdered flavors and colors, well, the really fine stuff, the lightest stuff, believe it or not, is actually going to fall to the bottom of the container over time. It's sitting there rocking and shaking as it gets shipped to UPS or FedEx. And what happens is all the big crystals will float to the top. And they're actually heavier, but they kind of, because of compaction, they float up, and the really fine particles, the lighter ones, all compact to the bottom. And when you scoop it out, you're going to have a mixture of your most heaviest stuff, which is usually sugars and acids at the top, and your flavor down at the bottom, and that's going to taste interesting. If you're making something like that and you do have different types of particle size, you may want to use a Ninja or some other high-speed blender, dump the entire mix in there, hit the Ninja for 30 seconds or a minute, and that'll beat it all up and make everything the same particle size. And then you can sift it through a size that you want, particle size that you want, and re-blend the other part, put it back in again, and you'll have a uniform powdered product. Best applications, I kind of talked about that a little bit, but think about, hot drinks. If you wanted to make your own instant coffee with flavors and cream in it, that's a good use of a powder flavor. Yeah, you're heating it, but guess what? You're only heating it for, you pour in your hot water like you're making a cup of coffee or a tea. So the heating process is about 5 minutes, and you're gonna start drinking it right away, and you're gonna get enough flavor from that, especially if there's a sweetener in, that you're still gonna taste that flavor. When I say it doesn't like heating, I'm talking about 30 minutes at 375. That really beats a flavor up. You want a flavor that's encapsulated or freeze-dried to go through that process, and then at the other end it's still going to taste like what you want it to taste like. Usages, I work in percents. I always work in 100%. I've trained myself to do that in the kitchen as well. I kind of see things in percentages. There could be 5 or 6% sugar. Most of the time there's a lot more than that. Let's say 10%. There could be 0.2% of citric acid in something. There could be a lot of water. So if it's a liquid formula, it could be 70% water, and all those other things make up the 30%. In flavor powders, you tend to work in about 0.5%, sometimes 1%, but not very often. That seems pretty high to me on most occasions. I can go as low as 0.1% or 0.25% as common numbers for a flavor powder. Flavor powders requires practice. It's not a science, it's more art. Science to make it, but it's an art to play with it. Stick with one company, and I don't just say that so you'll buy from Nature's Flavors. Whoever you buy from, you kind of want to stick with one company, because there's a style at every flavor company of how they make their flavors, and once you learn that style, you get used to that. You get used to their usages, and they tend to work along the same lines. We try to sell really concentrated flavors here, so our usages are low. We don't want to sell you water. We don't want to sell you sugar. So when you're using our stuff, it's going to be pretty strong.